The night of the bus stop, the rain was falling harder than usual that night. The streets of Chennai were slick with water, and the few buses still running were already full. Sundar Pichai sat in the backseat of a modest black car as his driver steered carefully through the dark. He was visiting India for a quiet personal trip, away from the noise of California, away from the endless meetings and the constant glow of screens. His plan had been simple: to see his mother, to sit in the house he grew up in, to remember who he used to be. But sometimes plans change. The car came to a slow stop near a traffic light that glowed faintly red. As Sundar stared out the window, his eyes fell on something he could not ignore. Under the old bus stop shelter, a young woman was curled up on the wooden bench. She wore a thin white nurse's uniform, already damp from the rain, and her head rested awkwardly on her arm. Her feet were bare, her shoes neatly placed under the bench. Her face was so tired it almost hurt to look at her. Sundar lowered his window slightly. The sound of the rain grew louder. The girl's shoulders shivered. He looked at his driver. "Do you see her?" Sundar asked quietly. The driver nodded. "Yes, sir." "She must be waiting for the bus." "But she's sleeping." "Yes, sir." "Perhaps she finished a night shift. Is there no way for her to get home?" "There is no last bus now. She may have to wait until morning." Sundar's hands tightened in his lap. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt a knot in his chest. He watched her a little longer. Cars passed by without slowing. A stray dog curled up by the bench, its fur wet and matted. A man on a bicycle splashed through a puddle without noticing the sleeping nurse. Sundar imagined what it must feel like to work all day or all night in a hospital, saving others, only to sleep at a bus stop in the cold rain because you could not afford anything better. His driver spoke again. "Sir, shall we continue?" "It is late." But Sundar said nothing. He opened the door slowly and stepped outside. The rain struck him instantly, cold, sharp, and relentless. He walked to the bus stop. The young nurse stirred slightly when his shadow fell over her. She opened her eyes halfway, clearly confused and still half asleep. When she realized there was a man standing there, she sat up quickly, adjusting her wet uniform and glancing down in embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't mean to. I'm waiting for the bus." Sundar crouched down to her level. "It's all right," he said gently. "The buses have stopped. Do you need help?" She shook her head stubbornly. "No, sir. Thank you. I'm fine. I'll wait." "What's your name?" "Deepa." "How long have you worked at the hospital?" 3 years. "And you always wait here at night?" Deepa hesitated before nodding. "Sometimes," she admitted. "When I cannot afford the auto, I wait here. I can sleep here if I have to. It is not so bad." But Sundar could see it was bad. Her fingers were red with cold. Her shoes were torn. Her uniform was threadbare. And yet she sat there with quiet dignity, as if this were normal. He wanted to tell her who he was, to offer her a ride, to solve everything right then. But something held him back. Maybe it was the pride in her eyes or the weight of her silence. So instead he said softly, "Do you like your work?" And she surprised him with a shy smile. "Yes," she said. "I like to help people, even when they don't notice." That answer stayed with him long after he got back in his car. The next day, Sundar could not stop thinking about her. While he sat at his mother's kitchen table, sipping tea, he kept seeing the bus stop bench in his mind. While he walked through the narrow lanes of his old neighborhood, he heard her quiet voice in his head. And by the time evening fell again, he had made up his mind. He dressed in simple clothes, no suit, no tie, and made a phone call to someone he knew at the hospital. "I want to visit," he said, quietly. "No one needs to know." When he arrived at the hospital that evening, no one recognized him at first. He moved through the hallways slowly, noticing everything: the overworked nurses, the long line of patients, the smell of antiseptic. And then he saw her. Deepa was standing at the nurse's station, holding a clipboard, her hair tied back neatly. She looked tired but calm, as if she carried the whole ward on her shoulders. Sundar watched her for a moment from a distance. She checked a patient chart, gave gentle instructions to a junior nurse, then hurried into a room without even noticing. He felt a strange mix of respect and sadness. Then he saw something else. A senior doctor scolding her harshly over a small mistake. She stood there quietly, her eyes lowered, taking the words without answering back. When the doctor left, she wiped her eyes quickly and went right back to work. Sundar followed her silently that night. He watched her comfort an elderly man who was crying in pain. He saw her help a little boy drink water without spilling. He noticed how she slipped an extra blanket over a sleeping patient without being asked. And each time she finished something, she looked even more exhausted. Finally, near midnight, he approached her again. "Deepa," he said gently. She turned, startled. When she saw him, she frowned slightly in confusion. "You?" she murmured. "Why? Are you here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked, "When does your shift end?" "At 4 in the morning. And then?" "Then I take the bus, if there is a bus. And if not," she shrugged. "Then I wait." Sundar looked around at the busy ward. He could hear the beeping of machines, the quiet moans of patients, the hurried footsteps of doctors. And he thought, how many people like her walk these halls unseen? How many sleep at bus stops while the rest of the world sleeps comfortably in their beds? He leaned closer. "Deepa," he said softly, "I saw you last night. I saw everything, and tomorrow you will see me." Her eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" She whispered. But Sundar only smiled faintly and walked away. Deepa stood frozen, watching him leave, not understanding. She felt a strange chill in her stomach, half fear, half curiosity. What could he possibly mean? That night, as she sat again on the cold bench at the bus stop, she kept replaying his words. The rain had stopped, but the wind was sharp. The dog curled up beside her again. And Deepa couldn't help but wonder, who was he really? And what would happen tomorrow? In the distance, the faint roar of thunder rolled through the sky. She pulled her thin uniform tighter around her shoulders. And somewhere far away, Sundar Pichai was already making a phone call that would change her life and the life of everyone. At the hospital, in a way none of them could imagine. The morning morning began like any other at the hospital, with hurried footsteps echoing down the polished corridors and the faint smell of disinfectant filling the air. Sunlight streamed weakly through high windows, falling in golden stripes across the floor. Nurses moved briskly from one room to the next, their arms full of clipboards and medicine trays, while doctors barked instructions and patients murmured quietly in their beds. No one noticed the man who walked in through the front doors at exactly 8 o'clock. He was dressed simply, in a pale blue shirt and dark trousers, nothing about him flashy or loud. Yet there was something in the way he carried himself, calm, steady, unhurried, that made a few people glance up before quickly looking away, as though sensing something unusual but not quite understanding it. Deepa had been on her feet for almost 12 hours straight when she first caught sight of him again. She was kneeling at a patient's bedside, adjusting an IV line, her back aching, her hair escaping its neat bun in stray strands. She turned her head and froze when she saw him standing at the nurse's station, speaking quietly to the head nurse. At first, she thought she was imagining him. But then he looked directly at her and smiled faintly, as though they shared a secret. Her hands faltered slightly, and the patient noticed, frowning in confusion. "Are you all right, sister?" The patient asked gently. Deepa quickly forced a smile. "Yes, I'm fine," she said softly, though her mind was already racing. What was he doing here? She had not slept properly since last night, and she had spent hours wondering who he really was. All she knew was that he had appeared out of nowhere, asked her strange questions, and left her with promise she could not understand. And now, here he was again, standing in her hospital like he belonged here. The head nurse's voice cut sharply through her thoughts. "Deepa," she called out, her tone unusually formal. "Come here a moment." Deepa rose slowly, smoothing down her wrinkled uniform, and walked over. The head nurse stood stiffly beside the man, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and respect. "This is Mr. Sundar," she said flatly, clearly unsure what more to say. Deepa looked at him closely now. In the light of day, his face seemed even more composed, his eyes steady but kind, with a quiet strength that made her stomach flutter nervously. "Good morning," Sundar said softly, his voice just loud. Enough for her to hear over the busy ward. Deepa lowered her eyes and murmured, "Good morning." "Sir," the head nurse cleared her throat awkwardly. "Mr. Sundar has asked to meet with the hospital director." "I will take him to the office now." Before he turned to follow, Sundar looked at Deepa one last time, his gaze lingering just long, enough to make her wonder if he was about to speak again. But he said nothing, only offered her that same faint, unreadable smile, and walked away. The next hour passed in a haze. Deepa tried to focus on her work, but her hand shook slightly whenever she thought of him sitting upstairs with the director. Something was happening. She could feel it in the air, but no one knew what dot meanwhile. In the director's office, Sundar sat calmly across from the large wooden desk. The director, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and an impatient manner, fidgeted slightly under his quiet stare. "So," the director said finally, forcing a smile, "what brings you here today, Mr. Sundar? I understand you have some concerns." Sundar nodded slowly. "I would not call them concerns. I would call them observations." "Observations?" "Yes. Last night I witnessed something that has stayed with me. I watched one of your nurses, Deepa, sleep at a bus stop after her shift. She was wet, cold, and clearly exhausted. No one stopped to help her. I spoke with her, and she told me this is her normal routine. I also spent time watching her work. I saw how she cared for your patients with patience and quiet dignity, even when she was treated harshly by a doctor in front of others. And yet, after giving so much of herself to this hospital, she still has no way to even reach home safely." The director shifted uncomfortably, his forced smile fading. "Mr. Sundar," he began cautiously, "we are a busy public hospital. Our staff are dedicated, yes, but resources are limited." "There's only so much resources," Sundar interrupted gently, but firmly, "are only limited when the will to change is weak." The director blinked, caught off guard by the quiet conviction in his voice. "I understand this hospital runs on tight budgets. I also understand your nurses and doctors work longer hours than anyone should. I am not here to judge you. I am here to help. But first, I needed to see it with my own eyes." "And what exactly do you propose?" the director asked, his voice a little uncertain now. Sundar leaned forward slightly, his hands folded neatly on the desk. "Tomorrow morning, I will return," he said simply. "And when I do, I will make an announcement to your entire staff. I need everyone present. No excuses." "May I ask what this announcement concerns?" Sundar smiled faintly again. "You may ask," he said, "but I would rather show you." With that, he stood and left the office, leaving the director staring after him in stunned silence downstairs. Deepa continued her rounds, though her heart beat faster every time she glanced toward the elevator doors. At one point, she thought she saw him step out, but it was only a visitor who looked nothing like him. Still, her thoughts spun like a wheel. What was he planning? Why had he spoken of her to the head nurse? And why had he chosen her, of all people, to notice? That night, as she finished her shift and walked out into the cool air, she found herself stopping at the same bus stop where it had all begun. The bench still glistened faintly from yesterday's rain, and the stray dog lay curled up exactly as before. She sat down slowly, her legs heavy from fatigue, and looked up at the stars peeking through the city haze. For a long time, she sat there quietly, listening to the sound of distant traffic and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. And then, from the shadows, a voice spoke softly. "You're wondering what will happen tomorrow." Deepa jumped slightly, her eyes darting to the figure leaning casually against the bus stop pole. "It was him. You shouldn't sneak up on people," she whispered, though her voice was weak. "I wasn't sneaking," Sundar replied gently. "I was waiting." She stared at him for a moment before asking, "Why me? Why are you doing this?" He studied her in silence for a few. moments before answering. Because, he said finally, the world changes only when someone dares to notice what others ignore. And because kindness, he paused, is the most powerful kind of wealth, Deepa swallowed hard, her throat tight. And tomorrow? She asked again, her voice barely more than a whisper. Tomorrow, Sundar said softly, his eyes meeting hers. You will see what it means to be seen. Then, without another word, he straightened and walked into the darkness, leaving her sitting there, her heart pounding in her chest, a strange mix of fear and hope swirling inside her. She stayed on that bench long after he disappeared from view, staring into the night, unable to sleep, unable to stop imagining what tomorrow could bring. And somewhere, deep in the city, preparations were already underway. Phone calls made, papers signed, arrangements set in motion for something that would leave everyone in the hospital speechless. Asterisk, the announcement morning came early for Deepa, too early. She had barely slept, her body tired but her mind restless. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him standing at the bus stop, standing in the hospital corridor, leaning against the pole in the shadows, his words echoing again and again in her ears. Tomorrow you will see what it means to be seen. But what did that mean? And why did her stomach ache with something that felt like both dread and hope? She arrived at the hospital before sunrise, as usual. The streets outside were still quiet, the air cool and sharp, carrying the faint smell of wet earth. Inside, though, something felt different. The corridors buzzed with low whispers. Groups of nurses gathered in corners, glancing toward the main hall. Doctors moved quickly, straightening their coats, adjusting their ties. Even the director himself, who usually arrived much later, was already there, standing stiffly at the end of the hallway, his face unreadable. Deepa felt her chest tighten. She walked to the nurse's station and set down her bag, her fingers trembling slightly. What's going on? She whispered to one of the other nurses. The woman leaned closer, her eyes wide. Haven't you heard? The entire staff has been told to report to the main hall at 9 o'clock sharp. No exceptions. Even patients' families are being kept out. Something big is happening. Deepa swallowed hard. She spent the next 2 hours in a fog, moving through her duties on autopilot, her mind elsewhere. When she finally heard the announcement over the loudspeaker, a calm but firm request for all hospital staff to proceed to the main hall immediately. Her heart began to hammer so loudly she thought everyone around her could hear it. The main hall was already full when she arrived. Hundreds of nurses, doctors, technicians, and janitors crowded this space, their voices low and uncertain. The director stood near the podium, shifting from foot to foot, glancing nervously toward the door every few seconds. And then the door opened. The room fell silent. Sundar walked in quietly. With that same calm grace, his hands folded in front of him, he did not wear a suit or carry any papers. But somehow, his presence alone seemed to fill the hall. He walked to the podium without hurry, and for a moment just stood there, letting his eyes move slowly over every face in the room. When his gaze landed on Deepa, she felt her breath catch in her throat. He spoke softly at first, but his voice carried easily through the hushed hall. Thank you for gathering here this morning, he began. I know you are busy. I know your time is precious, but what I have to say is important. Not just to you, not just to this hospital, but to everyone who has ever felt unseen. A faint murmur rippled through the crowd. Sundar paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. Last night, I stood at a bus stop and watched one of your nurses sleep on a bench after her shift. She was wet. She was cold. And she was exhausted. She told me this is normal for her, that she waits there night after night because she cannot afford an auto. She told me she works here because she likes helping people, even when no one notices. He paused again, his eyes scanning the crowd. I was humbled by her words, but I was also ashamed. Ashamed that we live in a world where someone who gives so much of herself to others must still sleep on a bench because she has no other choice. And ashamed that so many of us, myself included, have walked past people like her without seeing them. The hall was completely silent now. So, today, Sundar said, his voice firmer now. I want to do something about it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Though he did not look at it. Effective immediately, he continued. I am establishing a fund to provide safe transportation, proper housing, and additional support for every nurse and staff member of this hospital who needs it. No more sleeping at bus stops. No more walking home in the rain. No more waiting for the world to notice. The fund will also cover scholarships for your children and emergency medical care for your families. This is not charity. This is respect. This is what you deserve. There was a sharp gasp from somewhere in the crowd. Others simply stood frozen, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide, and he added, I am partnering with the hospital to improve your working conditions. Better meals, shorter shifts, mental health support, because no one can pour from an empty cup. And you, all of you, have been pouring into this city for far too long without anyone filling your cup in return. For a moment, no one moved. The room seemed to hold its breath. And then, quietly at first, someone began to clap then another. And another, until the hall erupted into applause so loud it seemed to shake the walls. But Deepa did not clap. She stood rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on him, her chest so tight it hurt to breathe. Her hands trembled at her sides, because she knew, though no one else did, that he had done all this because of her, and that terrified her. When the applause finally faded, Sundar stepped down from the podium and moved toward the exit. But as he passed her, he stopped, just for a moment, and looked at her with eyes so steady and kind. It made her knees feel weak. You see now, he murmured just loud enough for her to hear, what it means to be seen. And then he walked out, leaving the crowd still murmuring and buzzing behind him. But Deepa stayed frozen in place, her heart pounding wildly, because as she stood there, watching the doors swing shut behind him, she noticed something she hadn't before. The director, who had been standing stiffly at the side, was glaring at her, his jaw tight, his eyes narrow. And then, very deliberately, he turned and whispered something to one of the senior doctors. They both looked at her and smiled. But it was not a kind smile in that moment. Deepa understood something that made her stomach drop. While Sundar had given her hope, he had also painted a target on her back. And whatever was coming next, she could feel it, would not be easy. Asterisk. The storm after the light for the rest of that day. The hospital did not feel like the same place anymore. There was still the usual noise of footsteps on the shiny floors. The constant beeping of machines, the smell of disinfectant mixed faintly with tea and rice from the staff canteen. But beneath it all, there was something different. A heavy tension that everyone could feel, but no one dared to speak about. The nurses walked a little taller now, their eyes brighter, stealing glances at each other and whispering about the incredible announcement that morning. Even the orderlies and cleaning staff moved more confidently, as though the weight of invisibility had finally been lifted from their shoulders. But not for Deepa. She felt no lighter. In fact, she felt heavier than ever all day. She could feel the director's eyes on her, sharp and cold, like glass pressed to her skin. The senior doctor who had scolded her before now watched her with a strange kind of amusement, whispering behind his hand to others as she passed. Every smile she received from her fellow nurses was met by a glare from her superiors. By mid-afternoon, she knew something was coming, and it came sooner than she expected. Just as she was finishing with a young patient in room 12, a boy, with a broken arm who kept asking if Sundar was a movie star, she heard her name called over the loudspeaker. Sister Deepa. Report to the director's office immediately. The boy looked up at her, wide-eyed. Are you in trouble? He asked innocently. She forced a small smile and shook her head, though her stomach was already tight. No, little one, she whispered. Just work. The walk to the director's office felt longer than usual. Each step echoed louder than the last. When she arrived, the door was already ajar, and inside, the director sat behind his desk, his face calm but his fingers drumming a silent rhythm on the wood. Beside him stood the senior doctor, arms crossed, his lips curled faintly, in what could almost be called a smile. "Sit," the director said. Deepa sat. Her hands rested in her lap, clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. "You must be very proud of yourself," the director began, his voice smooth and low. "You've made quite the impression." She stayed silent, unsure what he wanted her to say. "Do you think you're the only one who works hard here?" He continued, leaning forward slightly. "Do you think the rest of us don't make sacrifices? Don't sleep less, eat less, give more than we get. And yet none of us," he gestured toward the senior doctor, "none of us have felt the need to beg a stranger for pity." Deepa blinked in shock. "I didn't beg anyone," she said softly, almost to herself. But the director chuckled humorlessly. "You think he chose you at random?" "No, sister. You let him see you like that. You let him think you are a victim, and now the entire staff sees you as a hero. And us," his voice hardened, "as villains." Deepa opened her mouth to protest, but the senior doctor cut her off with a sharp laugh. "You're clever, I'll give you that," he sneered. "You played your part perfectly. Sleeping at a bus stop, looking helpless and noble. It worked, but don't think we don't know what you're doing. You embarrassed all of us today." Deepa's cheeks burned. "I didn't ask him to do anything," she said quietly, though her voice trembled. "I never told him to come here." The director leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Well," he said slowly, "whether you asked or not, you've made this hospital look weak. You've made me look weak, and I cannot allow that to continue." He picked up a folder from his desk and flipped it open casually. "You've been late to your shift twice this month. You misplaced the chart in Ward 5. You left a medication. Cart unlocked last week. Small things. Yes, but enough to justify disciplinary action." Deepa felt the breath catch in her throat. "Are you firing me?" She whispered that the director's smile was cold and thin. "Not yet," he said. "But you'd be wise to stay quiet from now on. Keep your head down, no more talking to important visitors. No more stories about bus stops. Do you understand?" Deepa sat frozen, her hands clenching painfully in her lap. "Do you understand?" The director repeated. Louder. She nodded faintly, though every muscle in her body screamed against it. "Good," the director said, closing the folder with a sharp S and a P. "You may go." Deepa rose slowly and walked out of the office, her legs stiff and unsteady. As she passed the senior doctor, she caught a faint whisper from him, low and mocking. "Back to your bench, sister." Her ears burned as she walked down the corridor, but she refused to let them see her cry. That evening, as her shift ended, she sat again at the bus stop. But this time, the air felt heavier. The bench felt colder. And even the little dog, who had always curled up beside her, kept his distance. As though sensing the storm brewing inside her, she stared down at her hands, her fingers raw and red, and wondered if she had made a mistake. And then a shadow fell across the bench. She looked up and saw him standing there again. "What did they say to you?" Sundar asked softly. She shook her head, unable to speak. He sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the quiet strength in him. "You don't have to tell me," he said gently. "I can guess." For a long moment, they sat in silence. The wind pulling at her hair, the streetlights buzzing faintly above them. And then she whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "They want me to disappear." He turned his head slowly to look at her. "And what do you want?" She swallowed hard, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I want to stay," she murmured, "but I don't know how." Sundar studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, very quietly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. "What is this?" she asked, her voice small. "Instructions," he said simply. She unfolded the paper with shaking hands and stared at the neat handwriting covering it. Her eyes widened as she read the words, and then she looked up at him, her mouth slightly open, her heart thudding wildly. "You can't mean, miss," she whispered. But Sundar only stood, looking down at her with calm determination. Tomorrow, he said softly, everything changes. And before she could speak again, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving her alone on the bench, clutching the paper in her hands, her mind spinning with disbelief and fear at what he had just asked her to do. Asterisk, the choice of the paper felt heavier than it should have. Deepa held it in her lap all night, sitting on the cold bench long after the buses stopped running, long after the last shop closed its shutters, long after the streetlights flickered out. She read the words over and over, and each time her heart sank a little deeper, though she could not stop herself from reading again. The instructions were clear, step by step, almost too simple. Yet every line seemed impossible, tomorrow morning. Enter the director's office. Do not ask permission. Place this letter on his desk. Wait for him to finish reading. Do not interrupt. When he speaks, listen. When he asks if this is your choice, say yes. Whatever he says next, remain calm. The rest is already decided. Signed. Sundar folded the paper carefully and pressed it to her chest, as though she could quiet the storm in her heart just by holding it close. But nothing quieted. That night, she did not sleep. When the sky began to turn from black to a faint gray, she walked to a little temple she passed every morning but never entered. She stood outside the gate for a long time, watching the priest light small lamps, listening to the soft murmur of prayer from inside. Finally, she closed her eyes and whispered a few words under her breath, not even sure who she was speaking to. And then she turned and walked toward the hospital. As soon as she stepped through the main doors, she felt the air change. The staff stared at her as she passed, some with hope, some with suspicion, and others with something sharper, resentment. The nurses she'd always shared quiet laughs with now kept their heads down. The senior doctor smirked openly when she walked by, leaning against the wall as though waiting for her to trip. But she did not slow down. Her feet carried her straight to the director's office. She didn't even knock. The director was sitting at his desk when she entered, reviewing a stack of papers. He looked up in surprise, his brow furrowing. "What is this?" he demanded, though his voice stayed cold and measured. Deepa walked to the desk, placed Sundar's letter neatly in front of him, and stepped back. The director stared at the envelope for a moment, then glanced up at her. "What is this, sister?" he asked again, his tone sharper now. She said nothing, only nodded toward the letter. With an impatient sigh, he tore it open and began to read. The first few lines made his eyebrows lift slightly. By the middle, his face had gone pale. By the time he reached the final line, his hands were trembling. He set the letter down slowly, his eyes narrowing into "Is this a joke?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. Deepa shook her head once. "And you agree to this? You support this?" She swallowed hard but kept her voice steady. "Yes," she said. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, as though he couldn't believe the quiet defiance standing before him. Then, abruptly, he rose from his chair, the wooden legs scraping against the floor. "Do you even understand what you've done?" he hissed. "Do you know who you're dealing with? You think because you made a few promises you can march in here and dictate how this hospital runs. You think you can embarrass me twice in front of my staff? I have built this place with my own hands, my own sweat, my own sacrifices." Deepa held his gaze evenly, though inside her heart raced like a drum. "This is not about you," she said quietly. The director froze, his mouth hanging open for just a second before he barked out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Get out," he snapped. "Get out before I have security drag you out." Deepa didn't move because just then, the door behind her opened. And Sundar walked in, the director's face drained of color entirely. "You," he muttered. Sundar didn't raise his voice, didn't quicken his pace. He simply walked to stand beside Deepa, his hands resting lightly behind his back. "She has followed my instructions," Sundar said softly. "Exactly as written." The director's hands clenched into fists on the desk. "Do you think you can just walk in here and—" "Yes," Sundar interrupted, still calm. "That's exactly what I think." He placed a second envelope on the desk. "Inside," Sundar said, "you will find the transfer of full administrative authority for this hospital." Effective immediately, you are relieved of your position. The board has already signed. Your office will be packed and your access revoked by the end of the day. The director opened the envelope with shaking hands and scanned the documents. Inside, his mouth open, then closed. You can't, he began weakly. But Sundar only tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. I already have. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Deepa stood motionless, hardly daring to breathe. The director's shoulders sagged finally, his eyes darting back and forth, as though searching for some hidden escape. But there was none. He sank back into his chair, defeated. You won't win here, he muttered bitterly. This place will eat you alive. Sundar's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. Then let it try, he replied. He turned to Deepa then, and for the first time that morning, his expression softened. He said quietly. She followed him out of the office, her legs weak, her chest tight, her heart so full of conflicting emotions. She thought she might collapse under the weight of them. As they walked down the hall together, the staff began to notice. One by one, they stopped what they were doing, their eyes wide with shock, their whispers rising behind them like a tide. But Sundar kept walking, and Deepa kept walking beside him. When they reached the end of the corridor, Sundar stopped and turned to face her fully. You did well, he said gently. You were brave when it mattered. But Deepa could not bring herself to smile. What happens now? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Sundar's eyes darkened slightly, though his tone stayed calm. Now, he said, we rebuild this place, and we make sure it never forgets the people who keep it alive. Deepa nodded faintly, though a shiver ran through her, but before she could speak again, before she could even take another breath, the loudspeaker above them crackled to life, and a voice, sharp and panicked, rang out across the hospital. Emergency in Ward 3. All available staff report immediately. Emergency in Ward 3. Sundar's head snapped up. Deepa's blood ran cold. Because even over the loudspeaker, she could hear something in the background. The sound of people shouting, the clatter of metal trays hitting the floor, the unmistakable chaos of something terribly wrong. She looked at Sundar, her heart in her throat, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Fear. Without a word, he turned and ran toward Ward 3. And she followed, her feet pounding against the floor. The sound of her breath loud in her ears. Neither of them knew yet what they would find there. But whatever it was, they both understood. It would change everything. Asterisk. The heart of the stormed corridor to Ward 3 was a blur. Deepa could feel her pulse thudding in her ears as she ran, the soles of her shoes slapping hard against the floor, the sharp smell of antiseptic mingling with something metallic. Blood, maybe, that hung thick in the air ahead. Around her, other nurses and doctors streamed toward the ward too, their voices rising in panic, their hands grabbing at carts and equipment as they ran. When she and Sundar finally reached the door, they stopped just for a moment, just long, enough to take in what lay beyond. The scene inside was chaos. One of the oxygen tanks had ruptured, sending shards of glass and debris flying through the air. A heavy steel shelf had toppled over, pinning a young boy's father underneath. Nurses were shouting instructions to one another as they tried to move the man without hurting him further. Several patients were being evacuated as smoke curled up from a sparking. The electrical panel in the corner. Deepa didn't hesitate. Before Sundar could say anything, she ran into the room and knelt beside the injured man, her fingers already feeling for a pulse. She called out for a stretcher, her voice steady now, her earlier fear replaced by the practiced calm of someone who had lived through crises before. On my count, she told two orderlies, her hands gripping the edge of the shelf. 1, 2, lift. The man groaned in pain as they slid him out, but his eyes fluttered open, and Deepa gave him a reassuring nod before turning to the boy who stood frozen nearby, tears streaming down his face. He'll be all right, she told him softly. Stay close to me. All around her, the ward was a storm. People moving, shouting, crying. but she moved through it like an anchor, her presence quiet yet commanding. She wrapped a towel around a bleeding nurse's arm. She gave orders to the junior staff to keep the patients calm. She even climbed onto a chair to switch off the sparking panel before it could catch fire. And through it all, Sundar stood in the doorway, watching her. For the first time, he truly saw her as she was. Not just the tired nurse sleeping at the bus stop, not just the quiet girl who smiled shyly when she spoke, but as a force of nature. Someone who refused to crumble, no matter how many storms came her way. When the last patient was moved out and the man pinned under the shelf was finally carried away on a stretcher, the room began to quiet, the smoke cleared, the panic faded into a heavy silence. Deepa stood in the middle of it all, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion, her hands streaked with blood and dust. And when she finally looked up, her eyes met Sundar's. He stepped forward slowly, his shoes crunching over bits of broken glass until he stood right in front of her. "You saved them?" he said simply. She shook her head faintly, her voice hoarse. "We saved them." She corrected. He gave her a small smile, though his eyes still held a glimmer of something deeper. Respect, admiration, and something she could not quite name. Around them, the staff began to gather, their eyes full of wonder and gratitude. For the first time, the senior doctor who had once mocked her now stood with his head bowed, silent. The director, now stripped of his title, lingered at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable, though no longer full of contempt. Finally, Sundar turned to address everyone. "This," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "is why. We are here, not for power, not for pride, but for people. For moments like this, when everything seems to fall apart and yet someone steps forward anyway. Today that someone was Deepa, but tomorrow it could be any one of you. This hospital is not just walls and machines. It is all of you. Never forget that." The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the emergency lights above them. Then slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap, then another, and another, until the entire ward erupted into applause that rolled through the hospital. Like a wave, Deepa felt her cheeks flush with heat, though a faint smile tugged at her lips despite herself. She met Sundar's gaze again, and for the first time in what felt like years, she felt seen. Fully and completely. Later, after the ward was cleaned and the patients settled, Sundar found her again at the bus stop. The night was clear this time, the stars bright and sharp above them. She sat on the bench, her hands folded in her lap. The little dog curled up at her feet once more. He stood there for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to sleep here anymore," he said gently. She nodded. "I know," she whispered. "You don't have to work here anymore either. There are other places, better places. I can make a call." But she shook her head. "No," she said softly. "This is my place. Not because it is easy, but because it needs me." He smiled faintly at that, his eyes glinting in the starlight. "Ben, you will stay?" "Yes," she said. He reached into his pocket then pulled out a small key, pressing it into her palm. "What is this?" she asked. "A home," he replied simply. "Not far from here. Yours now. No more bus stops." She stared down at the key in her hand, her throat tightening. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. He was quiet for a long time before answering.